Good morning, great to see everyone here again today. Some familiar faces and some new ones. Always good to be at this particular conference for some of the topics and talks. Hopefully mine will live up to the billing. In terms of my talk, it's about NEC3. It's as easy as ABC. I did think about walking onto the tunes of Jackson 5, but that's probably a bit early in the morning for that, and my moonwalk isn't that particularly clever. So in terms of what I'm talking about, I'm going to look at the main and secondary option selection. So as you're going through the sort of cradle to grave process, starting point is picking your main options, your secondary options. And what I want to try and do today is sort of challenge perhaps some of the general wisdom around some of the option selection. From my experience, a lot of clients are selecting the main options, perhaps not giving it sufficient thought, and are then suffering afterwards with the schemes not performing how they wanted. They're not getting the value from the process. So I'm going to look at why you select the main options, what should be the key drivers behind them, and also how some of the main and secondary options interact. And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit around some of the ways maybe they can be used in different ways, innovative ways, to combat some of the problems. So, in terms of the starting point, I'm going to start with main option F. People tend to start with A and work through to F. So I'll start with main option F, the management contract. So perhaps a quick show of hands. Who's used option F? Anybody used option F? Is that 3, 4? Anybody currently using option F? That's 0, unless everyone's not quite awake yet and hasn't heard the question. But on the face of that, there's not a lot of use of it, which doesn't surprise me. For me, it's not a very common used option. And I do question in some ways the need for this particular option, whether it will continue on in future versions. I mean, the idea behind it and the benefits that are sort of espoused in the guidance notes as to why you pick option F when the employer does not have sufficient capability to manage or sufficient capacity. And yet the processes, the procedures, the change control, it's the same as all the other options. So if you can manage option F, you can manage options A, B, C, D, and E. So there's no differentiator there. So the next one is it coordinates the work of specialist subcontractors and suppliers. But again, if you look at the subcontract processes, the acceptance regime, the works information regime, it's the same under option F as A, B, C, D, and D. So again, there's no real differentiator here as to why you'd pick F across those other options. Those procedures and processes are the same. Perhaps the most important one is speed to site and overlapping design and construction. And this one I can see, this one makes sense, that this is a differentiator to why you'd pick a management contract, because you could start to procure your subcontracts as the design's progressed. So yeah, I can see here, here's a rationale for option F. But in terms of how option F works, the main contractor subcontracts the works, possibly all of it, but they can choose to do some work themselves. So in the contract data part 2, they can say they'll do some management, maybe some design, maybe some construction works. And to do that, the contractor then tenders a fixed price for that work or fixed unit rates. And the contractor is then paid the subcontract cost plus these fixed prices. But if we're trying to overlap design and construction, how can the contractor give a fixed price if actually the scheme isn't fully developed? They don't know what actually is going to be built. Therefore, they can't actually fix their price. So maybe a way around that is to have the contractor's cost as cost reimbursable so they can flex and change to suit the nature of the work. But isn't that actually option E? Because under option E, you have subcontractor cost paid at cost and you have the contractor's cost paid on a reimbursable basis. And if you want to go down some sort of schedule of rates type option for the contractor's own costs, then maybe something like an option D could be more beneficial, because at least you get some sort of target and incentive for the main contractor to control the subcontractor costs. So working through that, I'm not really sure as to what the differential is and why option F is there compared to some of the other options. And I think given its sort of use and its scant use, that may play to that rationale. Moving on then, the sort of key issue I want to talk about today really is options A and C and when you pick one or the other. Option A, quite simply, is a fixed price lump sum contract. Option C is a target contract. So when do you select one over the other? What's the rationale for selecting A as opposed to C? Now, one of the things that comes up in the guidance notes and elsewhere, and something I've heard commonly put forward is, the reason why you pick one over the other is the level of design development, the clarity over the scope of works. In that for option A, fixed price lump sum, you need a very clear scope of work. whether that's an output-based specification or whether that's a fully designed scheme. The client needs to know exactly what they want so the contractor can put a firm price to it and there's limited post-contract change. Option C can be used when the extent of the work done is not fully defined. So when you're not sure as a client what you want, you're going to have lots of changes. Option E's a good choice. Now, quick show of hands, who agrees with that logic and those statements? Hands up if you agree. So that's probably the majority there. Anybody disagree? Okay, there's a few there. Okay. Well, if you work it through for me, what this seems to be saying is there's a different risk allocation, A to C, to deal with this design development issue, this lack of clarity. But actually, when you look at the job, we look at the contract from a contractual standpoint, the actual contractual risk allocation is exactly the same in A and C. It's the same list of compensation events. So whatever would be a compensation event under option A would be a compensation event under option C. So any design scope change under option A that would lead to a compensation event would also be a compensation event under option C. There is no difference in design allocation or design risk. There isn't this idea that under option C, certain events, well, we won't have a compensation event for that, but we would under A. It's the exact same list of compensation events. So contractually, the risk allocation is the same, and yet there's this idea that actually you can have more design development. The employer can change their mind more under an option C. Now, one of the reasons people say that may work is because option C accommodates change better than option A. And again, this is what people often say. If you go option C, it's easier to agree the effects of compensation events. But again, I'd challenge that in that it's actually the same process under both contracts. It's the same notification process, same evaluation process, same quotation process, etc., etc. And if you go through the process, you assess time in the same way under A and C, disruption, consequential effects the same way under A and C, and the actual cost is the same thing. It's based on defined cost. So actually, it's exactly the same process. The only difference is in the definition of defined cost, which varies between the two options. So under those two options, you have a different definition, but one could argue that under option A, where you use the shortest schedule of cost components, it should be a quicker and simpler process to agree the effects of change. You've got a reduced definition. You've got a reduced list of information to be provided. Now, in fairness, I think you'd argue that under C, you can see the contractor's day-to-day cost, you know what they're spending on things. There's more access to their cost records to sort of prove costs. But even so, I'd still question whether actually option C is better at accommodating change. I get what people's views are. Is it easy to agree change under option C? Anybody think it's really easy? Hands where they find it really easy to agree change under option C. Okay, so this idea that option C is to be used when you don't know what you're doing, you're going to have lots of changes, I question. And for me, I think the basis of selection should be the same. In that if you haven't got enough firm information to go option A, I don't think you've got enough information to go option C. And a lot of clients pick option C when perhaps they haven't done the hard work of getting the scope nailed down, the works information very clear. They want to develop it post-contract. But they're going to have a lot of compensation events, a lot of change, and potentially a lot of problems if they choose option C on that basis. For me, the choice is all around the behaviours you want to drive post-contract. It's that sharing of performance. It's that sharing of risk between the contractor and the employer of any sort of, savings, any overspend. That's the primary rationale, not the level of spec, the scope, the definition of the works. So looking then at main option C, from my experience, this tends to be the most popular option. And again, just set a feel for how well it works in practice. Maybe a show of hands. Who's been on a scheme that suffered pain share? Where at the end of the job, as part of the final account, sorry, not an NEC term, as part of the final agreement, there's been pain share paid by the contractor. Hands up for that. That's quite a few. Hands if it's happened on more than 3 occasions. Okay, a few more, but quite limited. Okay, how many have been on schemes where gain share's been paid out? On more than 3 occasions. So it seems to be a lot more in gain than pain there, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. But how many people have been involved in schemes where perhaps the target has been reset or abandoned, where the level of change has become very extensive, there's been problems, and a deal has been done to either reset the target to match the actuals or just to forget pay and gain and go cost reimbursable. Anybody done those sort of schemes? Again, there's a fair few of those as well. So there seems to be a number of situations where it's being picked, but maybe it isn't delivering quite as expected. And again, this comes to another issue that is put forward as to why you pick option C. It's suitable for projects with a high level of risk. So projects whereby there's a lot of risk, and this contract allows you to deal with that. So, for example, there's lots of risk of third-party interfaces. There's risk of theft and vandalism. So these have to be risks that are the contractor's risks, otherwise there'd be compensation events. And what the contract says is these are shared. So the idea being here that the contractor may well get the estimate right and make gain share, or get it wrong and lose money. And if that target cost is the sort of best estimate of what the work should cost, but we're talking about very risky projects where there's a good chance the price could be too high or too low, does that mean the contractor is expecting to lose money on 1 in 2 target costs? If it is this genuine pre-estimate, win some, lose some? Conversely, does the employer expect to suffer pain on every other target cost contract? So, how does this deal with this high level of risk? And I think the issue for me is a bit about how the target is set. So if you are picking option C, you need to think about how you're going to set the target. What are you going to allow in there for this risk? Are you actually going to have the usual list of compensation events, the usual risks there? Are you asking the contractor to take on this real risky project? Or is actually another option, maybe option E, better? So there are some issues to consider about how you set that target, how it's used and when it's selected, and whether the contractor really is prepared to take the risk of losing money on every other project. Okay. And one thing I see a lot is that employers need to understand when they pick option C, they are going to share in the contractor's inefficiency and poor performance if it occurs. Option C, pay and gain, aligned objectives. If the contractor is efficient, does a good job, limited defects, creates gain share, both parties sharing it. Great. Conversely, the employer needs to understand that when they pick option C, they are going to share any pain. They're going to share the overspend, subject to disallowed costs, which are pretty limited. So poor performance, contractor's inefficiency, the employer is going to pay towards. And I'm seeing a lot of projects now, maybe they were let during some of the downturn in the market, maybe they were fairly tight target costs, but a lot of situations where contractors are going back to employers and saying my defined costs have gone up, and the employer's going, why, what's changed? Nothing, it's just cost more. And a lot of contractors scratching their heads, what do you mean it's just cost more? Well, I had a target, I hoped to do it for this, I've needed more resources, had some problems, I've spent a lot more. And the employer's then scurrying around thinking, right, how can I disallow this cost? How can I avoid not paying this pain share? But you can't do that. That's not the option you've picked. You've picked an option where you are going to share in that potential poor performance, that potential overspend. So again, particularly for employers, if you're picking option C, think about what you're letting yourselves in for here. Think about what could happen if it does go wrong on these high-risk, difficult projects. Okay, looking then in terms of option C, if you are going to go down the option C route, you pick option C. Another thing to consider is the pay and share, gain share mechanism. Okay, and for me, there is no sort of right or wrong answer around what the pay and share, gain share should look like. Commonly 50-50 splits are used as a starting point. Then there can be lots of complex versions with pay and share caps, gain share caps, reducing scales, all sorts of different ways of addressing it. The key thing for me is when you're picking your pay and share, gain share mechanism, is think of the behaviours that will drive in the parties. Think of how it's going to make them work together or not. If you go for 0 pay and share, 100% paying to the contractor over the target cost value, will that drive them to be risk averse, chase compensation events, try and talk up the target in the first instance? If you cap gain share, will that mean the contractor will stop to try and seek gain share below a certain level? So I think you've got to look at the behaviours it's going to drive and try and anticipate what will happen in various scenarios. And again, I see some clients looking at their pay and gain option thinking, right, this job's quite risky, I'm therefore going to limit my pay and share and put more risk onto the contractor. And again, if you're picking option C because you've got a high-risk project where there's a good chance the estimate, the target cost may not prove to be correct, Maybe you want a broader pain gain mechanism. Maybe you want less pain to the contractor because it's not really, going to be in their interest to take on a very risky project. They are going to be chasing compensation events, chasing target cost changes. So I think you've got to look again about how the pain gain interfaces with risk. Looking at main options B and D, and again, a quick show of hands, who's used option B? That's quite a good showing. Option D? Not so many. I mean, for me, I think option B and D are a little bit of sort of the unloved sort of two options in the suite here. And I think there's a great place for options B and D. I mean, over the last 10, 20 years, bills of quantities have fallen out of favour. People don't tend to employ QSs to do that function. But at the same time, these can be used as sort of schedule of rates type contracts, where you know the nature of the work but not the extent. So if you're doing repetitive work, track laying, you're doing flood defence work, you're doing something that's quite repetitive, then options B and D may be good options. And particularly option D for the target cost. That's not commonly used, and people often think option D, there's a lot more work, I've got to remeasure the target. As the employer, I take the risk of a change in quantities. Whereas option C, that doesn't have to happen. But option D can be used quite successfully where you know the type of work, but not how much work. And I'm seeing that being used by some companies now in almost an earned value analysis approach, where you have a schedule of rates, and then during the course of a year's program of, say, maintenance works or some sort of capital improvements, you measure the actual volume of work done, multiply it by the tendered rates to create a final end-of-year target based on the actual work done by the tendered rates. And then you compare that to the defined cost plus fee incurred to work out a pain gain. So you're comparing a value to cost type measure, but it's the actual value as actually constructed, the actual quantities used. And that's quite a good way of dealing with this uncertainty of scope at the start of the year, where you don't know how much work you're going to do, but the type of work. So for me, if you're looking at the options again, think about B and D. Could they be used effectively for your particular type of work? Looking then at the secondary options and how these fit together. And again, the sort of general commentary is that the majority of secondary options work with all the main options and they all fit together. There's a couple that do say your X12 and X20 you don't have together, but the majority are all available in the modular set to bolt together. First thing for me is option X1 and X2. And whether you need both of these. If X2 is for changes in the law, so during the course of the year, a change in the law occurs, there's an increase in landfill tax, the government changes the rules on national insurance, that will lead to a compensation event, and that will lead to an increase in the contract sum, the total of the prices. But also, if you've got X1, that increase in cost should feed into general construction inflation. The following year, construction works will be more expensive because of that change in the law. So if you've got X2 and X1, is it being double counted? Is there a danger it will come in twice? Okay. So I know some employers have some guidance not to select these two options together, but to consider which one is more suitable. In fairness, X2 is a compensation event, so that can lead to an extension of time and other consequences rather than just a financial effect as X1. But then again, how many of these changes in the law lead to delays normally or cause an increase in time as opposed to just cost? So maybe worth considering whether you pick both of those options or just one or the other. Next one is about time and performance to time. And you've got options X6 and X7. So X6, bonus for early completion, X7, delay damages. And I've had some people sort of question whether you can use both of these. Can you have both the benefit of a bonus and the threat of a penalty, that would be illegal, certainly in this jurisdiction, but some sort of delay damages? Certainly from my views, yeah, you can have both. I see no reason why not to. If time is that important, then that's the way to both incentivise positively and, if you like, negatively through X6 and X7 used together. But then, again, other people say, if you're using options C and D, the target cost options, do you need to have X6 or X7? In that, does not the target cost in itself drive performance to time? Time is money. If we finish earlier, then we'll save money, we'll create gain share. If we finish late and we overrun, we'll spend more, we'll suffer pain. So do you actually need X6 and X7 if you're having the options C and D? And also, could there be a possibly counterproductive behaviour here? In that if you've got a bonus X6 for early completion, the contractor, if they achieve it, get all of that bonus, 100% of it. If you've got delay damages and the contractor suffers delay damages, they take all of the pain of that, 100%. So a contractor could possibly look at that and think, well, hang on a minute, I'm going to suffer some sort of pain here through delay damages. If I accelerate and put on lots of additional resources, unproductive working weekends, paying bonuses on an actual cost or cost reimbursable contract, that would be paid. So you could find them billing the client for accelerating for them to achieve a bonus, or billing the client and having to share through paying share half the cost of the overrun for trying to avoid hitting delay damages. So again, I think it's worth looking at how those interact if you're picking those options. And it may be, in fairness, as an employer, you're happy to pay for the acceleration costs because time is so critical. So that's fine, but maybe just think through, is that the behaviours you want to drive? And then also then, if you look at option E, use of option E and also X6 and X7. Under option E, I can see a much greater driver for wanting to have some sort of incentive for the contractor to finish on time, not to sort of string out the job and have lots of costs towards the end by the job overrunning the anticipated programme. So you might want to use X6 or X7 there. But the problem you've got is for X6 or X7 to work, you must have a completion date, and that completion date must be able to move with compensation events. But option E is normally selected where you don't know the full extent of the work, where the scope is still being developed, it's still evolving. So on that sort of basis, how can you set a firm completion date? How can you manage compensation events that affect time to maintain a valid completion date? So is it really sensible or suitable to use option X6 or X7 with main option E? And again, I think that's possibly worthy consideration depending on the nature of the project. Final thing to consider on the slides there is just X16 in terms of retention. The standard option in the contract is retention being an amount withheld from the contractor, and I think there's obviously a move in the industry towards retention bonds, and it may be a good idea to bring in some sort of additional secondary option that specifically allows retention bonds to be selected rather than traditional retention. So maybe that, rather than having it as a Z clause, having it as a standard clause may be an improvement for future versions of the contract. Okay, moving on to the sort of final bit of the talk about incentivisation and different ways you can incentivise performance. There's a few slides here which give some sort of background to incentivisation I'll skip through. But really, idea of incentivisation, it's about aligning the supplier's performance with the employer's objectives. So the first thing to understand is what is the employer's objectives. It's very commonly time, cost or quality, but it may be different things for different clients. Some clients may think whole life cost is more important than capital cost. So maybe you want to pick a selection of options that play towards a whole life cost agenda. It may be disruption to the public. If you're refurbishing a station and that station's got to close for a period, you may actually not want to do that. You may want to keep as much of it open as possible. So maybe that's a driver for performance, not time, cost, quality. Maybe customer satisfaction linked to that. So you've got to think carefully when you're looking to incentivise performance, what is it you want to incentivise and how that will interact with other factors. And the idea of some sort of incentivisation mechanism is to improve performance. So you have to be able to measure the improvement. So you must be able to set a benchmark level. And setting that starting point, that benchmark, can be very challenging. If you set it too high, the contractor can easily make gain share or can easily deliver a benefit with doing nothing different, with business as usual. But if you set it too low, the contractor will struggle to achieve it and may on day one think that's impossible, I can't achieve that incentive, I'll stop working towards it. So you've got to set a reasonable and robust benchmark figure to walk towards. And then the idea is you are going to reward the contractor for improved performance. So normal performance, normal rewards, improved performance, improved rewards. You may also want to have some sort of negative penalties there where if they don't achieve the levels, then they suffer some sort of reduction in their reward. But the idea is to align these objectives and move forward together. So looking at incentivisation in the NEC, There are a number of options within the contract that play towards the incentivisation agenda. If you want to financially incentivise a reduction in capital costs or construction costs, options C and D are there. We're trying to drive down the defined cost, create gain share, both parties share. In terms of time, spoken about X6 and X7, and there's also key dates. And obviously within delay damage, you can have sectional completion as a way of driving performance to time. And then for other things like quality, health and safety, maybe customer satisfaction, you've got KPIs. And they can be introduced via X12 or X20. And also on quality, you've got low performance damages to try and make sure the finished product works as specified. So there's a number of ways there inherent in the contract that you can link together to incentivise performance. But there's also some other alternatives that people may want to consider. And I see other people using, not just in the NEC, not just in this country, but elsewhere and in different sectors. One issue we've already spoken about is option C isn't ideal where you don't have a clear scope, where you're not quite sure what the employer wants, where there will be a lot of change. And option C may be better. But a lot of clients think option E, it's an open checkbook, it's cost reimbursable. I still want some sort of financial performance incentive for the contractor. So one way to do that is to bring in KPIs and maybe have a KPI that is budget. So you set a KPI that is, here's the budget for the scheme. If the contractor delivers the scheme for lower than the budget, there'll be a gain share. There'll be some sort of bonus payment. So you can have almost like a watered down, a more subtle version of paying gain. Now under the standard NEC, options X12 and X20 only work as a bonus, not as a negative. So you could possibly have a Z clause to make it work both ways, that there could be a reduction in the return for the contractor if they don't achieve the budget figure for the project. But it could just be that they risk part of their fee or an element of their fee rather than the whole, amount of an overspend. So when you do have high risk projects, here's a way of maybe not giving the contractor too much risk, but some form of incentive to perform to financial constraints. What we also see as well is on sort of big oil and gas projects where they have engineer, procure and construction management techniques. So these are multi-billion-dollar projects where no single contractor can take the risk of delivering the scheme. So the employer will employ a contractor to manage it and then directly employ the contractors to deliver large packages of work. But there where they have this management firm, again, they want to incentivize that management firm to control costs, to proactively work to reduce the cost of the individual subcontract packages. And so what they do there is they often tie the performance of that management contractor to the overall budget cost and have some sort of reward or risk sharing mechanism based on the fee of that contractor. So they're not going to take a hit on, if the £3 billion project overspends by 10%, because that would just kill a business. It's that they will have an element of their fee at risk where they can get enhanced profit or reduced profit depending on the performance of the overall project. So maybe some subtle ways of having pain share, gain share without having the full-blown option C or D. Whole life cost. Again, I've seen some employers go down this road where for many employers who will own an asset for 50 or 100 years, actually capital cost is minor. And they'd rather the contractor came forward with good ideas on how to increase capital cost if it reduced whole life cost. If a contractor could come forward and say, if we get a better quality piece of rail, we have to replace it once every 50 years rather than once every 25, lot lower cost, lot less disruptions to the public, is that a good idea? Most employers would say yes. But if you pick options C or D, the contractor is driven to do exactly the opposite and look for the cheapest rail that meets the spec. So again, maybe you can look at ways of incentivizing whole life cost performance. And how I've seen this done in practice is that some employers have tried to create a whole life target cost, where before the job starts, they estimate the construction costs and estimate the operational and running costs for a period of 20, 30 years, whatever. You then build the project, you then compare and rerun that calculation using the actual construction costs. You've got much better asset information now because you've built it, and you rerun the calculation and see whether there's been a saving made in whole life cost, not just the capital cost of construction. And that can work, but it can be quite difficult because very often you're forecasting savings, that may not become apparent for 30, 50 or 100 years. So a lot of clients get nervous about paying money out for savings that might not actually have been realised as yet or may never actually happen. But there are some mechanisms around that, and maybe BIM and the use of that and the knowledge it brings and the asset information may help improve that sort of process. So something worthy of consideration. Again, maybe it's a secondary KPI, maybe not as the prime pain gain, but maybe an X12 or X20 option. Final thing to talk about really, to be brief, is when you engage the supply chain. Because as we all know, typical value curve, the earlier you can get the supplier on board, the greater the savings potential. It's that feasibility outline design where the savings can really be made. So how can you do that? One option that some of the water companies and other asset owners do is they set a target right at the point of project inception. They've got sufficient costing information, they know the type of the work, they've got such a good cost base, they can estimate what the job will cost, even at the early stage when they've just got a need identified. So you set a target cost level there, you measure at the end of it the defined cost plus fee, and you can work out some sort of pay and share, gain share. So that's a great option where you've got enough information to set that robust target cost at the start of the project, which is only really possible for certain types of work. Another option is to have a two-stage approach. Works on a similar sort of basis. At the project inception, you set an initial estimate, and then you incentivize the contractor, get them on board through some sort of ECI approach, and encourage them to try and create savings in that first stage during the feasibility concept outline design stage. And then you share the savings around that process. You set a target cost at the second stage, and again, you have a more traditional target cost approach. So hopefully, you're getting the contractor on board early, incentivize them to come up with savings and ideas, and then set the target, and then have a second bite of those savings. Difficulty with that is around how do you incentivize in that first stage? Are you going to say to the contractor that if the scope changes, if we encounter risks and the price goes up, they'll share some pain during the concept design stage? That can be quite difficult. If you're going to share gain, how much? Because there could be some big savings made, and maybe you only want to pay a percentage of the savings. Another issue you've got is there's a danger that some of the good ideas may be held back till the target cost's been set. And it's how you get the contractor in that ECI stage to come forward with the good ideas. But if you can, that two-stage process can drive some real value. So just to summarise really, hopefully some food for thought around when you pick the main and secondary options, particularly around A and C, and whether A and C should be used in certain circumstances, and whether C is right when you don't have clarity over what you want as an employer. Think about how some of the secondary options relate to the main options and how they interface, and consider some of these alternative options for having maybe some sort of financial incentive through KPIs, budget control, whole life cost, and maybe a two-stage process. Okay, thank you.